Hello everybody, in this video we're going to talk about how to solve quadratic equations using the method of completing the square. So let's look at what is completing the square, when can we use it, and what are the steps to follow in order to use this method. So completing the square, we need to do this for the expression x squared plus bx, okay? So it kind of looks like a binomial, or it looks like a trinomial, but missing the constant at the end, and that's exactly right. Normally we'd have x squared plus bx plus c, and we've talked about how to factor those trinomials. I'll link the card to that video right now. And so that's essentially what we're going to do today. So how do we do that? Well, we have three steps. Step number one, we want to take 1/2 of b, or we want to say b divided by 2. Once we do that, we're going to square that result. So we're going to take b divided by 2 and we're going to square it. And then we're going to add that to our binomial x squared plus bx. So our final trinomial, what it's going to look like is down here in this box. We're going to have x squared plus bx plus b over 2 squared. How is that useful for us? How does that help us to solve a quadratic? Well, this is going to give us what we call a perfect square trinomial. So we've talked about how to factor perfect square trinomials and the special product rule in which that factors as. I'll link that card right now if you want to go back and watch that process. But essentially what it gives us is what's called the square of a binomial, right? And that's what we see right here. So once we have our trinomial x squared plus bx plus b over 2 squared, we can then factor that as x plus b divided by 2 quantity squared. So we'll work through that and see some examples of why that is, why does that factor as a square of a binomial, and then we'll look at a couple examples at the end of how to actually solve a quadratic equation by completing the square. Okay, so let's look at our examples. The first set of examples, we're going to do 3 where we just complete the square and we factor the trinomial. So we're not solving the quadratic yet, we're just completing the square. All right, so number 1, we have x squared plus 18x. So our first thing we want to do is take our b value and divide it by 2, okay? So once we do that, we're going to say x squared plus 18x plus b divided by 2, so 18 divided by 2. We need to square that, and here we added it to our previous binomial, right? We added it to x squared plus 18x. Okay, so now we can say x squared plus 18x plus, and now 18 divided by 2 is just 9. Now we can square 9, so we get x squared plus 18x plus 81, and that would be our perfect square trinomial. We have now completed the square. Okay, so now from here, we can factor this as the square of a binomial. So remember when we factored, I've already linked the card to how to factor when a is 1. Really, we just want to say, okay, what two numbers add to b and multiply to c? So in this case, what two numbers add to 18 and multiply to 81? Well, that's 9 and 9, right? So this would factor as x plus 9 times x plus 9. And those are the same binomial, right? So now we can write that as x plus 9 quantity squared. So now we can see what we saw at the beginning. We complete the square to form our perfect square trinomial, and then we can factor the perfect square trinomial as the square of a binomial, okay? All right, now let's look at the next one, and we'll try and do it in a little less detail so we can go through it quicker and you don't have to write down as many steps, but we can always look back here at this first example to check on what we're doing. All right, so for the next one, we have x squared minus 4x. So x squared minus 4x plus b divided by 2, so negative 4 divided by 2, that'd be negative 2, squared would be positive 4. So there is our trinomial. We have completed the square, and now we're going to factor this. So this is x minus, because we have x squared minus 4x, or essentially, what was b divided by 2? Well, b is negative 4 divided by 2 was negative 2. So this is x minus 2 quantity squared. All right, and that would be our square of a binomial, okay? All right, for number 3, notice that we have a b value that is odd, right? So we have 7x. So once we divide 7 by 2, we're going to get a decimal or a fraction. Let's leave it as an improper fraction. Okay, so we're going to say x squared plus 7x plus b divided by 2, so 7 over 2 squared, okay? So now let's do x squared plus 7x plus, and let's just square 7 and 2. So we get 49 over 4, and let's leave it as that. That is still a perfect square trinomial. It just looks a little funky because b was an odd number. So now we can factor this. Remember, we're going to factor as x plus or minus b divided by 2. So here we had x plus 7 over 2, and we square that, okay? So that is the process of completing the square and then factoring that perfect square trinomial as the square of a binomial. So now let's see, how will this help us when solving a quadratic equation? So let's look at a couple examples. Notice the difference. Example 1 and 2, we have equal signs, right? So now it's a quadratic equation, and we're going to use the process of completing the square. Also notice a couple differences. On number 1, a is 1, which is good. That's what we want. We have to have a be 1 in order for us to use completing the square. On example number 2, a is 2. So we have to adjust that before we can complete the square, and we'll get to that in just a second. All right, so now for number 1, notice how we just have x squared plus bx, right? X squared minus 2x on that one side. That's what we want. We want that portion by itself. So if this said x squared minus 2x minus 3 equals 0, I want to add that 3 so that it looks like what we have at the beginning, okay? So that's what we want to make sure that we do. Now, it's already in that form, so we don't have to do that. So we're going to go ahead and complete the square for what we see on the left side. So we're going to say x squared minus 2x plus, and now b divided by 2, so negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1, squared would be positive 1. Now, this is now an equation, so we can't just go around adding and subtracting whatever we want. We have to do the same thing on both sides. It's an equation. We have to keep it balanced. So since we added 1 on the left side, we also have to add 1 on the right side. So now let's simplify. We can write our perfect square trinomial now as the square of a binomial. So we have x minus 1 squared, quantity squared, and 3 plus 1 is 4. How did we get x minus 1? What's b divided by 2? Negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. So that's where that came from. Now we can undo the square by taking the square root of both sides. Okay, so now we're going to get x minus 1 equals, and whenever we introduce a square root, we have to be careful. We need to make sure we take the positive and the negative square root. So this is positive and negative. So positive and negative, and the square root of 4 is 2. So now we're going to add 1 to both sides, and now we can think about this as kind of two separate equations. So we have x equals positive 2 plus 1, and we have x equals negative 2 plus 1. So this one would be x equals 3, and this would be x equals negative 2 plus 1 would be negative 1. And those are our two solutions to that quadratic. And we did that by completing the square. Now let's look at number 2. All right, notice there's a couple of things that we need to fix. First of all, we need this 10 to be on the other side. That's what we just talked about on the previous example. So now we have 2x squared plus 12x equals 10. Now we don't want a to be 2, we want a to be 1. So we can go ahead and divide both sides by 2, and that's going to divide all of our coefficients or constants, all of our numbers by 2. So now we have x squared plus 6x equals 5. Okay, now we can go ahead and complete the square. So on the left side, we're going to say x squared plus 6x plus b divided by 2. So 6 divided by 2 is 3. 3 squared is 9. Once again, we cannot just add 9 to one side. We have to add it to both sides to keep our equation balanced. So now we're going to factor x squared plus 6x plus 9 as x plus 3 quantity squared, right? Remember, b divided by 2 was 3. 5 plus 9 is 14, so now we're ready to take the square root of both sides. Once again, if we are introducing the square root, we have to take the positive and the negative value. 14 is not a perfect square, so I'm just going to leave it as a square root of 14, and we're going to have to approximate our solutions. So depending on how your teacher or whatever program or assignment you're working on, how they want you to write the answer, they might want you to leave the root in the answer, or they might want you to plug it in your calculator and round your solution to the nearest 10th or 100th or what have you. So we'll round ours to the nearest 100th for this example. So now we're going to subtract 3. All right, and now this gives us our two separate equations. So we're going to say x equals negative 3 plus the square root of 14, and x equals negative 3 minus the square root of 14. So you could leave those as your answers, or you could now approximate. So there's my approximation, and I'm just going to take my calculator and we're going to plug those in. So I'm going to say negative 3 plus the square root of 14, and this gives me 0.74, right? We're rounding to the nearest 100th. And we're going to do negative 3 minus the square root of 14, and this gives me negative 6.74. And that is how we use completing the square to solve a quadratic equation.